Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final plenary dialogue of SPHR15. My name is Bob Brecha, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Dayton, and I'm also the research director of our Hanley Sustainability Institute, which shares physical space with the Human Rights Center, something that I find to be, it's a new experiment for us, but something I think is very appropriate. I'd like to thank you all for your participation in this conference. I'd like to thank you for staying for the final session. That's always a challenge as well. And I'd like to recognize again the hard work put into organizing this conference by Mark, Christy, Joel, Yusuf especially, and Monty Moyer, and putting together what I think has been a really interesting, a very, very nice conference. So thank you. I'm also going to do a quick shameless plug. This came up in the last session, but in 1 month, November 5th through 7th, in this very same space, we will be having a conference on Divest, Invest, and hosting a conference and a conversation on how institutions and universities, can divest fossil fuel holdings and invest. UD was one of the very first and larger universities to divest from fossil fuels and to work on that over time. So we will be having another interesting conversation on sustainability, again, in 1 month at the beginning of November here. Our panel today, or this afternoon, is centered around the theme of sustainable environment, and we are going to be broadly addressing 3 different questions. What are the major challenges to fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals? What are the immediate actions needed to do so? And whether a rights-based approach to environmental sustainability can lead to more collaboration between the human rights and the environmental communities. And these are really the same conversations we've been having on other panels, just from a slightly different point of view here. Our panel members, I'll introduce them in the reverse order of that in which they will speak, are Jacqui Patterson, the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Tariq Banuri of the Economics Department of the University of Utah, who was also in the UN Sustainable Development Program and an author or very involved in several of the IPCC assessment reports. And Richard Hiskes, who's now at Grand Valley State University and was for a long time in the Political Science Department of the University of Connecticut. I think we will have a slightly different orientation and a different format here. Each of the panelists will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for each of them to respond to the others, and then we will go into questions, we hope, for about the last half an hour of the session. So with that, Rich is going to give a somewhat broader overview, so he will let him take that over.
Yep. I don't need that. So my colleagues on the panel are going to stand because they have slides. I don't have slides because I don't know how to do PowerPoint, but we'll maintain a consistent format here. It is a sort of daunting prospect to try to close this conference. It's been such a rich experience with so many ideas and great talks that have happened that we've heard over the last couple of days. After the last panel, I felt like maybe I would rename my talk something a little upbeat, like a very promising species, because I am going to talk about that. But I'm going to talk about environmental rights, and it's not really that formal a talk, but I did put a title on it, which is The Honor of Human Rights. And I'll start by saying that one of the things that's become clear in the last couple of days is that rights are very future-oriented things. They may be based on, past legal agreements or philosophical arguments, but rights function as guarantors of future behavior or future treatment. And that's important, I think, and not commented on enough. They belong to humans partly because of our species' ability to contemplate and plan for the future. That's what we usually mean when we talk about the ability of rational thought. And they're partly based on the needs and harms that we experience today that seem pressing enough that we need rights to protect us from them in the future. And I think that as claims about the future, rights have a very close conceptual affinity with the concept of and the practice of making promises. Both rights and promises, I will argue, are things that belong uniquely, singularly, to humans. And I'm going to invoke a little bit of Thomas Hobbes to help me make that argument. So I want to explore this relationship between rights and promises, specifically in the context of environmental human rights and climate change, because as Pope Francis said last week, protecting the environment is our promissory note to future generations. And even though I'm not a Catholic, when you get it right, you get it right. And I think that that's a very important statement for him to say. Because it is that, and because those future people have a right to this promise from us, it's a matter of our dignity and honor to protect the environmental rights of future generations. And that's not a weak thing to say. Saying that it's a matter of our dignity and honor is not a weak obligation. It's not about charity. It's not about being a good citizen or a good person or even a good Christian. That maybe is the history of the environmental movement. To say that it's a matter of right gives it some legal teeth. At least that's what I'm hoping. That's what I've been arguing for the last few years. So, as the Pope recognized, if we don't protect the environment, if we don't take steps to stop climate change, we are violating rights. We are violating rights of future generations and destroying honor and dignity as essential human attributes. So I want to explore that a bit. And for those of you who teach human rights or take courses in human rights, it's a bit of a surprise even to talk about honor. I mean, honor is not something that is very much a part of human rights discussion or political theory discussion. Within human rights especially, honor most immediately brings to mind this act called honor killings, which is the slaughter of women who are victims of wartime rape by their families, by their fathers and brothers. Honor also is a hierarchical concept, it seems like, and it's about inequality, even at a great university like the University of Dayton. The honors program is for special people, right? They're not equal, they're better. And so honor sort of carries that inegalitarian connotation that we sort of not want to associate with the absolutist egalitarian concept of human rights. When I was at UConn, the honors director thought maybe we should make the honors, the human rights major an honors program only. And I said, yeah, that's a good idea, but we kind of believe that everybody has human rights, not just smart people. So that sort of shut down that discussion. But honor is often something that is raised in the context of what is a gender inequality situation. And it's a militaristic virtue to some extent, too. So for all these reasons, honor is kind of ignored within political theory, since it seems like a virtue of a former era, you know? Plato talked a lot about honor, about Platonic guardians or aristocrats in the later era, with knights protecting the honor of damsels in distress. And generally, there was this whole population called women or ladies in waiting, and they were waiting for a long time. So I understand why we don't talk about honor, but I kind of think that it's a high price to pay for the liberation that human rights brings to lose this concept. So I decided to look at it a little further. And there are all these inegalitarian, hierarchical, aristocratic, gendered, and militaristic connotations of honor, but in everyday speech, we also think of honor as keeping one's promises. Someone whose word is good, someone who keeps his or her promises is an honorable person. That's one of the sort of everyday connotations of that. So for me, this is significant because I've argued that the real foundation of human rights, Michael's right, there's a foundationalist position here, is not reason or moral autonomy, but following Hobbes in the 17th century, the unique capacity of human beings to make promises. Like Hobbes, I think that that's why we have human rights. That's what makes us special as a species. Nobody else does this. And I know ducks mate for life, and I know penguins seem to do that too, and male penguins find little rocks and bring them over to the female penguins to betroth them, and when that was in the Pixar movie, jewelers all over the world rejoiced, right? Because yes, there's a reason to buy a rock for someone that you love that you're going to mate for life with. But I think that for Hobbes, this is the way he makes the argument. The state of nature that Hobbes describes is a very unhuman place because, he says, it's impossible to keep contracts or promises there. So this famous paragraph in Leviathan, I'm not going to give a Hobbes lecture here, but you've probably heard about this famous paragraph in Leviathan that ends with, life in the state of nature is poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. And I always think that sounds probably like your first boyfriend. But still, Hobbes means it in a broad way, that because there's no government there, and because we can't read people's minds, nobody can work together. Nobody can make promises. And he says, so what's missing in the state of nature? Turns out just about everything that human beings do that's unique to us. He says there's no agriculture, there's no industry, there's no arts, there's no culture, there's no navigation, there's no letters, there's nothing. All that requires collective behavior, right? All of that requires that we make promises to each other and keep them. So Hobbes says, in the state of nature, there's a few natural rights that emerge. And I don't want to give you all the chain of logic here, but he says, the first right is to protect yourself. The second right is to take everything that you need. So far, that doesn't make me that much different from any other animal, right? They know how to do that. He says the third natural right is the right to make covenants, to make promises. And you know where he's heading with this. He's heading to the social contract, that we have to contract together to establish government. But for Hobbes, that's what makes us a very promising species. We do that. No other species does that. So we are capable of extraordinary things like culture and education and politics and religion and everything that marks us as a species. So the first thing that our ability to make promises does for us as a species is give us a logical reason for rights. It's just logic for Hobbes. It has nothing to do with, endowed by their creator or any of the other arguments. I mean, it's just logic. To be human, we have to be able to make promises. Therefore, we have the right to whatever it is that we need to be able to make promises. And the first thing he says we need is government. This also means that rights are very relational in nature. You know that rights always invoke the presence of somebody else. Rights invoke a promisor and a promisee. If you're alone on a desert island, you don't have any rights. It requires other people, and I've argued that in an important sense, that means that rights don't come from something special within us, some foundational thing like reason or autonomy. In an important way, rights emerge from between us, from how we relate with each other. And as a foundation of human dignity, it's that ability to promise that gives us this special standing, this difference, this capability of extraordinary acts of collective creativity. That's what makes us a dignified species. So the rest of our human rights follow really from that, and Locke says, that there's more that follow in society, and he talks a lot about the right to property. But that means that there's a sort of constructivist side to human rights too. They don't all have a foundation in something within us. So that's a very brief summary of state of nature theory about human rights. What I think is that these features of human rights are best evidenced by looking at environmental human rights and asking the question, can arguing for environmental human rights strengthen a kind of sustainability argument. Bring some teeth, some legal teeth, to environmental efforts. First of all, environmental rights are the sort of poster children for human rights in general. There is nothing, if rights are all future-oriented, there is no right that's more future-oriented than environmental rights. Partly because, and that's just like promises, right? The environmental harms that we talk about, when we talk about environmental rights that we should have in response to those harms extend out for hundreds of years, thousands of years if we're talking about radioactive waste. So the environmental harms and therefore the duties to protect human rights are the ones that occur mostly, almost entirely in the future, but they affect us too, because we live with polluted water and we live with polluted air. But we can only mitigate our own environmental harms by taking steps to mitigate them in the future, because they are long-term harms. So we should make this promise. We should accept environmental rights, because to do so is to acknowledge the true basis of rights as caring for the future. But there's Hobbes saying, yeah, but you know what the problem with promises is? They're dangerous, like every contract, because somebody has to act first. So Hobbes says, so when you make promises, you've got to know that the person you're promising is an honorable person who will keep his or her promise in return. And of course, we can't know that, because we're talking about future people. They don't exist yet. So if we make promises to them, how do we know that we're going to get anything back, that they're going to continue what we started? So environmental rights, I think, have to stress a communitarian aspect too. Somehow we have to figure out, how can we get to know those people in the future so that we can trust them enough to protect their rights by making our promise to them? Habermas calls this the constitutional aspect of human rights, because we need to feel like we share a community, that we constitute a community with other people, so that we see them as people like us. I've argued in my work on environmental rights that is a good reason for constitutional rights, constitutional environmental rights, because we think of people in our community defined by our Constitution as people who believe like us. That's what constitutions do. They last for hundreds of years, and they apply to people like us. But I think that Peter Berger says it a little better when he says, the role of honor is to connect each citizen to the idealized norms of the community. And this community that we have to think of as going on for a very long time. So I would say that we have dignity as individuals, maybe even as solitary selves, through the protection of human rights. But honor is what roots us and our dignity into a community with shared norms and constitutional principles, and that requires us to honor the people like us who share those norms and principles. So, future persons can never be perceived themselves as honorable unless we recognize their rights and our promises to them. Their dignity depends on us honoring that promise by including them as having a real and present place in our institutional community. Now, for various reasons, I say that has to be the nation state, because, as David Hume said, it's really hard for any of us to really care about people living on the other side of the world 6 generations from now. But if every community on earth does this, we could achieve the same thing. And 147 nations in the world today have added to their constitutions constitutional environmental rights. And by defending those constitutional environmental rights, we pledge that their honor, future generation, is important to us and to ours. And it also means that protecting the environmental rights of future generations, honoring our promissory note to them, as Francis said, is the only way we can protect our own environment in our lifetime. Our rights to a safe environment depend on our legal, constitutional recognition of the future's rights to the same things. Seeing the connection between our rights and those of the future is the only way to protect both. And if we do that, if we exercise the political will that's necessary to make political decisions based on that very strong legal and constitutional obligation to honor the promise to and rights of those who come after us, we can do this. We can clean our environment both for us and sustain it for future members of our community. We will. We can. I promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Tariq, you're...
See.
Let me make sure we get this.
I need the screen also.
I think we should be fine. Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for staying. Thank you to Mark and Christy Belton, whom I don't think I have the pleasure of meeting, and Yusuf, and everybody for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. It's a great conference and very happy. The only problem is that as one of the last speakers, it will be difficult to keep you awake, so I want to rely a little bit on the good friend PowerPoint. You know, they say that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So, so what I want to do is, actually it follows very much on Richard's presentation, the idea of what is the challenge of the environment, how does it link with some of the human rights issues in particular, how does it, what have we done in the last couple of 100 years which is now jeopardized by the way the environment seems to be behaving. Hopefully it will show up. There it is. So let me start off by just saying what the problem is. This is a slide which I put together, which I thought, I didn't put it together, the picture is there, but I thought I'd sort of run it through it. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Scaling it to 46 years, think about that we've been on this planet for 46 years. We started on the 2nd of October 1969. Some people here must remember 1969. The Rolling Stones were on the top of the charts, and we had just landed on the moon, and Honky Tonk Women, if any of you recognize it. The Earth is formed 1969. 6 years later, 1975, the first beginnings of life on Earth. Another 5 years, and photosynthesis starts. Another 12 years, atmospheric oxygen, which means we could live outside of the water. And then, of course, 17 years later, the Cambrian explosion, which gave us this huge explosion of biomass. 2 years later, the vertebrate land animals. A year later, the dinosaurs show up, and 2 years later, they disappear. This morning, 11:30, no, actually, 12 noon, we arrive on this planet. Today, the Earth is 46 years old. At 12 noon, we show up on the planet. 1 minute ago, the Industrial Revolution began. And in that 1 minute, we have destroyed half the world's forests. In that 1 minute, we have filled up the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and basically threatened all life upon Earth given this. This is not sustainable. This is really the beginning of what the challenge is that we are looking forward to. No comment on this one. Sorry about this. Just leave it there. Now, the way we are addressing this, let me just say this, that you see, again, these are all different strands that I'm trying to pull together. But one important strand is that we are now in a situation in which we live as if we are in a single country. We live on this planet, which is an interconnected world. Things that happen in one part of the world affect us. We are no longer isolated from each other. And as in all societies, we need a foundational basis to live. And the foundational basis that we've always had in building up society, I think that comes straight up from Hobbes, is the notion of a shared concept of justice. In the 20th century, and this is the second point I want to make, is in the 20th century, this concept of justice was finessed through the concept of economic growth, or through the experience of economic growth. In the future, the age of growth has ended, partly because of climate change, partly because of the slide that I just showed you. In the future, this shared concept of justice will have to be based on the need to live within our means. It is not only a means of just legitimizing action, but actually building society. I think chapter 13, which Richard referred to from the Leviathan, when he builds up this argument, one of the things he says is, he doesn't talk about justice so much as equality, that the only basis for equality in human society is murder. The only basis for equality is murder. You may be stronger than me, but I may be cleverer, or I might have two brothers. And so the lion can kill the lamb, but the lamb cannot kill the lion. But any human being, no matter how weak or how isolated, can kill somebody else. And that is what is the basis. If we don't respect it, it is a threat that can always take us over. And that's where a lot of the motivation for justice, for making promises and making sure promises are met, because that's the basis for life. Now, huge jump. In the 20th century, actually starting a little bit earlier, Peace of Westphalia, and then the Concert of Europe, 1815 to 1914, one of the things that we started pursuing was this idea of peace. Now, this is not a new idea. It's peace between nations, because it's the same idea on the basis of which we created society within the nation. Within society, creating society within the nation requires a concept of justice, of protecting each other, etc. But at some point in time, we started creating it at an international level. And that was true in the concept of Europe, 1815 to 1914. It was also true in the case of the Peace of Westphalia. In the 20th century, we have done repeated efforts to sort of build it up. And these efforts always come at the end of wars. If you pardon the gory metaphor, we kill 1 million of our young people and then look at the entrails to look for the signs of perpetual peace. That's exactly what we have done. We killed several million of our children in the First World War, and then we came together for the League of Nations and the ILO in 1919. Another 18 to 20 years later, we killed another several million of our children, and then we came together to build up the United Nations and the Human Rights Commission and so on and so forth. Now, this is all a struggle. Then we went through what I would call the development wars, and then we started talking about development. Now we are in the middle of an environmental set of wars, increasingly about oil, but you will see about others as well. And so we are talking about other ways in which we are going to do this. And in all of them, the notion of justice has been very central. Every time we start talking about peace, every time we start talking about bringing people together, about perpetual peace, the notion of justice has been at the center. Universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based upon social justice. It's the language of the Treaty of Versailles, in the League of Nations, going towards the League of Nations, and then this is in the preamble of the ILO. Conditions exist to produce unrest so great that the peace of the world is imperiled. Poverty anywhere is a threat to prosperity everywhere, the ILO perspective. In the United Nations 1945, peace must be founded on the intellectual moral superiority, solidarity of mankind. If man is not compelled to have a recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, human rights should be protected. The question I'm trying to make is that whenever we have tried to come together to talk about creating a permanent basis for peace, we have talked about the centrality of justice, about giving everybody a right. Now, this is the basis for the international system. This is a basis for building upon our own internal social systems. Let me just make one more step of the argument, and then I'll bring it back to the climate. ILO was set up in 1919, and it actually provided us a model of how do we operationalize this. We are concerned about social justice. We are concerned about people's rights. What do we do? And the ILO basically had 3 strategies, and then we added a 4th. Set standards and floors. Obviously, the labor rights, minimum wage, working day, occupational safety and health, etc. Create rights, right to collective bargaining, right to seek judicial redress, as we were talking earlier today. And the final one, monitor. set up periodic assessments, information dissemination, naming and shaming, et cetera, as a way of creating this. The fourth one we added starting in the 1960s by setting targets and milestones. By when do we achieve this? What is the result of this? The International Development Strategy in 1962 of the UN said all developing countries should have 5% growth rate, 1% of GDP, later on reduced to 0.7%, should be given as official development assistance. Commodities should be stabilized. Set clear targets and some kind of milestones. 1983, Jim Grant comes and takes over UNICEF and says, we shouldn't just talk about these things, we should say something and get it done. The idea of goals comes from that. Child immunization, by 1990, it has to be done, and it was done. MDGs 2000 comes from the same source, SDGs come from the same source. Now, summarize, the main point is, we are a warlike species. We have created a basis for peace within nations on the notion of justice and good governance and so on, between nations on the notion of a commitment to sort of a system, national sovereignty, et cetera, and then some kind of a commitment to a notion of global social justice. That commitment first expressed itself in the ILO, in labor rights, then human rights, women's rights, children's rights, et cetera, and we had a number of ways in which we have tried to do this. Now, we have achieved certain successes, but the one thing that helped us greatly was this process of economic growth. And I will have a few more things to say on this, but this is from J.R. McNeil's wonderful book, Something New Under the Sun. Communism aspired to become the universal creed of the 20th century, but a more flexible and seductive religion succeeded instead, the quest for economic growth. Capitalists, et cetera, all worshipped at the same altar. Growth disguised a number of sins, and adherents proposed that only growth could resolve such sins. The growth religion, on balance, was quite useful in an empty world, that's Herman Daly's word, but today it has created a crowded and stressed world and shows no inclination to adapt to the change. Yet it is an iron law of nature that if humans do not choose wisely, nature will choose efficiently. Now let me sort of come back to this. I want to bring us back to climate change, but remember, these are the trends that I wanted to show you. Number one, that we've been pursuing peace through a certain system. Number two, that we've been helped by the process of economic growth. What has happened? Economic growth, one consequence has been, if you start from the Industrial Revolution, one consequence has been a massive increase in inequality. There's global, the blue line. But the biggest part of that global inequality has been what we call inter-country inequality. That's one of the results. Now, all of this has a bearing on what I'm going to say next. We have a number of environmental problems. The foremost one, the one that is really staring us in the face today, is climate change. This is from the third assessment report of the IPCC. John Schellenhuber, who Bob has worked with, he noticed this in 1997. This is a diagram which basically shows what is the effect of climate change, different levels of climate change. The yellow, red, and orange show how positive we are. And basically, what he said is, oh, sorry, the line has moved. What he basically said, I'm sorry, this line should be over here. What he basically said is that if you look at 2 degrees, you realize that we are confident that climate change is going to hurt us. The only problem is that today, we know that that 2 degrees is also not very safe. It's very dangerous. Not only is it dangerous tomorrow, is it dangerous today? Already starting in 1985, we've been seeing the results in terms of increasing disasters, economic damage, insurance increases, et cetera. But there's a bigger problem to climate change. We've had a number of challenges, including resource challenges. Every time we had a resource challenge, we solved it exactly in one way, through the use of energy. Energy helped us. It was our friend. If you think about energy, think about this up to about 1750, 1775. The bulk of the energy used in the world was muscle and firewood. That's what it was. Muscle, horses and elephants and camels and so on, and firewood. That was the source of our energy. And suddenly we discovered the treasure of the ancients. First coal, and then 100 years later, petrol. And all of a sudden, our energy consumption shot up. And that shooting up of the energy consumption has given us economic growth, has given us prosperity, has given us health, and it has also given us peace. Because after a little while, we realized that we actually don't have to fight each other anymore. We don't even need slaves because energy gives us, every person in the world today has approximately 70 slaves working for them. Not every person, on average. In this country, we have 250 slaves on average working for us day and night because of the energy that fossil fuels and others provide for us. So all of a sudden, we entered into a new world. This is the world of economic growth. It actually not only created prosperity, it created a basis for cooperation. Cooperation is much more effective today than conflict. The reason why rich countries do not fight with each other is because nothing that you can get through fighting outweighs what you're going to lose because of the fighting. Because cooperation is really because we can use much more energy. But this energy is distributed very unequally. This is the kilowatt hours per capita per day. You know, the bulk of the world is actually concentrated here at less than 35 kilowatt hours per person per day. But the developed countries are 100 and above. And if you think in terms of human development, they don't get too much out of it. We need maybe about 100 kilowatt hours per person per day. But the problem is this. These countries need more growth. If they get more growth, they benefit. I can tell you what would happen to Malawi if its income goes up 10 times. I cannot tell you what will happen to the United States if its income goes up 10 times. I mean, what's going to happen? No difference. Your quality of life, we cannot tell how it is going to be different. The only way in which the quality of life of the United States is going to improve is if our health improves, nothing else. So GDP actually becomes irrelevant, energy becomes irrelevant, it only is relevant in this area. So the problem is this. Climate change is an environmental challenge, it's an existential challenge, but its biggest problem is that it has disabled and turned against us the very thing that was our friend, namely energy. Because energy itself has come into a problem. So what do we do? That's a very nice quote from Abraham Lincoln in the House Divided speech. We need to know where we are in order to move forward. And I'll quickly run through this and then come back with a couple of... We have actually, following on what I said earlier, we have gone through a lot of discussion on climate change. In the climate process, we are meeting in Paris. There is no disagreement, notwithstanding what the deniers tell you over here. Globally, between governments, there is no disagreement on the substance. The only disagreement between countries is on the concept of justice. What is it? What kind of solution is a just solution which will be sustainable? That's the only difference. We had a grand bargain in Rio in 1992, in which we put in a lot of equity and justice-related things, including the famous common but differentiated responsibilities. By 1997, in Kyoto, everything disappears, and we go back to market solutions. Nothing happened. In Bali, we started search for a new grand bargain, and we've been struggling ever since, and hopefully we'll come back in Paris with something, but the question is whether it's going to be enough. Let me jump over this because I'm taking too much time. If need be, I can come back to it. So, can people read this? So what do we do? There are some sources of pessimism. Leo Cullum is actually one of the great, he died unfortunately in 2010. The problem is, in climate change, the problem is we know that the total amount of greenhouse gases that we can emit over the next 40 years is fixed. So a lot of people are basically sort of saying, okay, you take so much, you take so much, you take so much. The result is that everybody is digging in their heels and saying, I want more. Okay? And so for 20 years, we've been going around saying, how do we reduce the greenhouse gases? The reason why we can't do it is because we're kind of dividing up the patrimony and nobody can agree on how much they want to take, okay? And that's thinking inside the box. The cartoon says, never, ever think outside the box. what happens to the poor countries? This one says, remember how I said I was happiest when we had nothing? Well, that's where the poor countries seem to be going. So this one, this diagram, basically these three diagrams, the area under the curve is the same. That's what the climate science tells you. The total amount is fixed. You can reduce it quickly or you can reduce it fast, but basically this is the total amount you have to be fixed with. So I'm taking the red line. Now, supposing you say developed countries reduce their emissions as quickly as possible, it still means that developing countries have to do it, which basically means they cannot grow. And so you have an unequal world which will get frozen in time. And that's kind of a challenge that we've been trying to live with. That's what I mean, that the real issue is justice. The real issue is not the climate change itself. So the question is, can we actually pull this line even faster in order to give some space for developing countries to grow? And we don't have an agreement on this. The rich and the powerful countries cannot come up to the bat because they're having their quiet desperation time because of financial crisis and other crises and so on. And so all that we are saying is, let everybody do a little bit and let's hope that everything works out. Nobody's making you do anything you don't want. I'm just saying we're all headed for Dodge City and we think you should come along. I mean, that's kind of the way in which the climate process has been going. This is a research challenge also. Here's this person saying, I'll be happy to give you innovative thinking. What are the guidelines? Now, this is my last couple of slides. The question is, what do we do? Isn't Leo Cullum great? I mean, he's the greatest. Enough storyboarding, let's shoot something. So this is my bottom line. The age of growth is gone. Growth has been our friend, but the age of growth is gone. We have two problems. One is we want to be able to live beyond the age of growth, and two, we want it to stick around until that time that we are ready to live beyond the age of growth. And these are two challenges that we need to confront. Without growth, through which we finessed the social justice problem and we protected human rights, everything is in jeopardy. Can we buy a little bit more time for the human race to grow up? We think that this requires a form of collaboration. Rights of the weak and the vulnerable need to be protected. That's where the Sustainable Development Goals 1 to 5, poverty and hunger and so on and so forth come. Rights of and to nature need to be protected. That SDGs 6, 7, and so on, so that the future, as Richard was saying, we can make a promise to the future that we'll have a world to live in. And the right to overcome gross forms of inequality so that we can create a basis for solidarity across the planet. That's SDGs 8 to 11. That's kind of the structure. We think economic growth is still relevant over here. We do need to parse it. We do need to make it happen. It's no longer relevant over here. The question we need to ask is, can we create a system in which half the world can grow and the other half remains stable and they still are able to work with each other? We don't have that system yet. And finally, there's the elephant in the room. We started with energy. The reason why we had the 200 years of growth process is that we suddenly got this huge amount of energy and we've used it quite effectively. We've used it also for killing each other, but we've also used it for prosperity and peace and so on and so forth. The question is, you go back to the diagrams that I showed you earlier. Those diagrams said this amount of greenhouse gas emissions are fixed. And the only thought we have is how do we divide it up? But one way we can do it is to say, can we actually move these out a little bit? And that means, can we shift to renewable energy? Can we shift to something which will give us a little bit more? It will not buy us time forever, but it will buy us a little bit of time until we all grow up and can learn to live with each other. And that's what the Sustainable Development community has been doing. These are all the crazy ones who thought of these ideas of coming across, and they were able to bring these things together. I think that challenge now is in some sense so close to us that we cannot avoid it anymore. And that's the challenge that we need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. Jacqui. And I think now we've been kind of zooming in, and Jacqui said that knew she was going to be doing some more local scale issues, and we went from the broad philosophical to to these big issues of climate and energy, and now we'll look at the next stage. And along the way, we got a great introduction to the New Yorker.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Hopefully we'll be able to keep everyone awake in this. So I'm not so much actually just focusing on the local, but actually connecting the local to the global. So just to clarify that. With the NAACP, when I started to do this work, it was interesting because people really didn't see how climate change fit in with our civil rights agenda. And there was a lot of skepticism, a lot of concern about kind of the really critical issues that we had going on in our communities, including high rates of police brutality, murder, HIV, all of these different issues, and just didn't see how, especially how climate change had been messaged up until then in terms of being about melting ice caps and so forth. And so there was a concern that we were just doing it because we had gotten a grant to do it, and it didn't really have anything to do with our social justice agenda. And so it's really been my job up until now to really have conversations about how climate change is a threat multiplier, and really how it intersects with everything that we do, really inextricably, climate change and environmental injustices in general. And so you may have heard of Naomi Klein's "This Changes Everything." And so climate change both changes everything, and it also is impacted by everything in terms of, so we talk about the inextricability of all of these different social justice issues. And so I'll be talking about that in the context of how connecting local and global around climate change and around these processes, including the Sustainable Development Goals and COP20, the Conference of Parties number 21 for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we talk about kind of our current course that we're on in terms of having the one thing that unites the global South nations and marginalized communities in the United States is that we're all kind of having this shared historical context, as has already been alluded to before by my co-panelists, around kind of rampant extraction and exploitation of human people as well, humans and natural resources, and then the trade, manufacturing, finance policies, then rules kind of benefiting corporations and industrialized nations at the expense of human rights of communities, and that's what I'll be kind of talking about in a little bit. And so first, just talking about the framework under which we view these issues, and certainly the human rights framework and the civil rights framework, and we see how climate change and environmental injustices are a threat and a violation of all of these rights, both in terms of how they're affecting communities, as well as even how some of the ways that we're trying to address them affects communities, some of the remedies being almost worse than the original problems in some sense, and I'll illustrate that as well. And then in that, we talk about an equity framework around how we're actually dealing with these issues, so everything around who's involved in decision-making, how allocation of benefits happens, who's invited to the table, and what their role is at the table. All of that is important as we consider where we are and where we need to go. And so when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they're the ones that kind of specifically reference environmental and climate justice. But again, as I said, all of them are really interconnected. And when I started out doing this work, I studied social work and public health, and I was a daycare teacher. I actually thought I wanted to be a daycare teacher for the rest of my life. And I really feel like I could have. I loved small children. But I keep saying that 20 years ago, when I was sitting in a floor surrounded by 18-month-olds, playing with them, I never thought that I would be in front of a group of utility lawyers giving recommendations on equity in the utility business model. But it's because as I kind of decided to go into social justice and make the world better for those 18-month-olds that I was sitting around with, it really becomes this necessity to be an expert in all these different things because of the inextricability of all of these different issues. So as we said, energy is directly related to education, it's directly related to food, and all of this is directly related to environmental injustice and climate change. So really, in the course of the presentation, we'll talk about how all of these are impacted by and impact this path to what we call climate justice. And so yeah, these are just kind of illustrations of how all of these things are intersecting. So just a list of the 17 sustainability goals to kind of get us grounded in that, around peaceful, inclusive societies, combating climate change. It's just funny to see it as a separate bullet, because really all of these are bullets towards that.
And then talking about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the principal aim of the Conference of Parties number 21 is to achieve a universally legally binding agreement that will enable us to combat climate change effectively and boost the transition towards resilient, low-carbon societies and economies. And the objectives under that are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to keep global warming at less than 2 degrees, and to mobilize $100 billion per year from developed countries to enable developing countries to combat climate change while promoting fair development. So all of that kind of just to keep in mind in terms of the context. And so when we're talking about the linkage between, again, marginalized communities, low income, and communities of color, as well as certain populations in the United States and global South nations, we talk about common cause, some of the real impacts that we're seeing in our communities and in these countries. So whether we're talking about the drying up of our once fertile land that's no longer producing because of the impacts of climate change, and the exacerbation of, in the United States, already existing food insecurity issues where people are more likely to get their food, low-income communities and communities of color often are more likely to get their food out of a corner store than a supermarket, much less a farmer's market. So that means they're getting foods that are heavy in sodium, sugar, preservatives, and so forth, as opposed to foods that are rich in nutrients and so forth. And as we see this progression of catastrophic climate change and the lessening of the availability of affordable and nutritious foods, this is only going to be exacerbated. We have, and we also see these situations of drought, but drought kind of as a natural condition, but also the privatization of water and how this all kind of links up as well, as we see more and more privatization of water and more people facing water shutoffs that are happening in different places. And this is the crisis that we heard about last year in Detroit, which continues. In Flint, there was just a notice that went out a couple of days ago saying that the water is lead contaminated, so people are no longer able to drink the water there. A couple of months ago in Baltimore, a notice went out that said 23,000 people were going to have their water shut off because of non-payment of bills. So these circumstances just continue, and then we know that the increase in extreme weather events from climate change are affecting us in the United States, and the communities that are most vulnerable to climate change are facing, death if their poor housing is of a poor housing stock. They're facing financial destruction if they don't have homeowners insurance or flood insurance or the various clauses that you need to be able to protect yourselves from that. And then loss of land, loss of culture, and so forth from these disasters. And we know that there's whole countries that are being devastated. It's interesting because everyone was focusing on Joaquin in terms of what it meant to the eastern seaboard while it was actively ravishing the Bahamas. And so it was just interesting because you would just show it over the Bahamas and you'd be thinking to yourself, there's people in the little red zone, but yet they just kept talking about what it meant in terms of the course of the United States. And now I don't know what's actually happened to the Bahamas in terms of relying on the real media for that. But in the, whether it's countries like Vanuatu that was struck by a cyclone and so forth, that are actively being just, decimated by these different disasters that are happening. And then again, in the United States, as I said, we have communities that are unable to evacuate like other communities, persons with special health needs and so forth, who are more likely to die from these disasters and other communities. When we were in the UN climate talks a couple of years ago in Warsaw, it was at the same time the super typhoon Haiyan was coming through, and Yeb Sanyo, the negotiator from the Philippines, was actively crying on the UN floor, both crying because he was concerned about his family members back at home, but also crying because of the frustration of being in a place with so little power as the Philippines and other small nations have compared to the might of the G20, the G8, and so forth, who have so much power in those situations, but they are the ones who relatively are less impacted as nations, and also the ones who are most influenced by corporate entities. And then right here in the United States, we know that whether it's Superstorm Sandy that took the New York subway system underwater, or people often think of only the storms and so forth in terms of hurricanes and so forth, but don't think about the fact that the increase in snow is actually also tied to climate change, to catastrophic effects for many communities. And as I said before, with the Bahamas and other nations facing these major disasters as well. And then we talk about sea level rise. In 2009, the Maldives actually had a cabinet meeting underwater to illustrate internally and to the world that this is where they're going to be in 20 years. So now 15 years from now, they're going to be permanently displaced by sea level rise. They right now have a sea level wall built around their country, and they're in active conversation with Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, because literally in 15 years they will no longer be able to inhabit the landmass that they're living on now. But that's not isolated to the Maldives. In the United States, on the left we see Kivalina Island, Alaska, and on the right we see Thibodaux, Louisiana, both of which have whole communities that have to move within 15 years due to sea level rise. In Thibodaux, they're losing a football field size of land mass every hour due to not just sea level rise, but also because the land is sinking because of offshore oil drilling. So again, we're just on the wrong path in terms into really damaging effects for certain communities. We see coastal erosion in Benin. We see this increased flooding in the Horn of Africa. And we actually, NOAA actually made this statement talking about the various coastal regions that are under threat, that today's flood is tomorrow's high tide. And in Miami, they talk about these king tides that happen, and they're happening in greater frequency. In places like Gulfport, Eastwick, Pennsylvania, all these different places that have had what they call 50-year floods kind of every couple of years now. This is the kind of increase that we're seeing in flooding in different areas. And of course, it's the communities that live in the low-lying areas, that live in floodplains, who tend to be the low-income communities and communities of color who don't have the wealth to buy homes that aren't in the floodplains. Then we also talked about the intersection with gender justice issues, which has also been mentioned before. This is some folks getting together around gender justice in one of the climate talks. Some of the ways that we see intersections with gender include the fact that women, if you look at each and every of these disasters, whether it's the earthquake in Gujarat or the tsunami or the Haitian earthquake or Hurricane Katrina, and even the BP oil drilling disaster, there's an extreme spike in violence against women, both domestic violence as well as sexual violence in a lot of these cases. Also, when women are having to walk in sub-Saharan Africa and different places where women's responsibility is to actually get the water, women are having to walk now in Zimbabwe. Women who used to walk for 5 kilometers to get the water are now walking 10 kilometers to get the water. And it's a female, so it's not just women, it's also girls. So we have girls who are actually not in school anymore because just getting the water and getting back to the house is taking up their entire day. So we see many, many, many gender intersections as it relates to climate change and environmental justice. This is one such person making that walk. We also see, because of these resource wars, we also talked about an increase in women used as weapons of war as well, and experiencing sexual violence in war. This is actually a picture of two of the women from the Philippines standing with Kathy Eglin, who's from Gulfport, Mississippi, and who was a survivor of Katrina, who had to evacuate her home during the Katrina catastrophe, and she took her family, her elderly aunts, a couple of neighbors that had to evacuate. And so they really were sharing common cause around that impact. So we talk about loss and damage, which is defined as when the impacts of climate change go beyond what is possible to adapt to. So there's a lot of conversation around adaptation, but it's not possible to adapt if your home becomes uninhabitable, if your family's farmland has turned to desert, or if you've lost a family member. So we really have to talk about these deep impacts that certain folks are feeling more than others, and that we'll all feel as this increases. And this is just some of the examples of the recent instances of loss and damage where people have lost their lives and so forth. And so we also talk about this disparity in terms of access to the extraction and exploitation in certain communities and people who aren't accessing the same resources that are being extracted from their countries or their communities. So Nigeria, for example, which is this oil-rich nation where it's a major contributor to our oil markets. And this is just a picture that really tells the story. This woman is drying cassava next to an active natural gas flare in Nigeria. So we have millions of people there in Nigeria who don't have access to electricity, but yet in this oil-rich nation, and the irony there. And this is another such an instance where this is the Navajo family in the Four Corners region of the United States. Behind them, that coal-fired power plant is one of 4 coal-fired power plants within 50 miles of where their reservation is. But yet on the porch are 2 coolers because they don't have electricity like 70% of the people on that Navajo reservation. They also don't have running water like 70% of the people on that reservation. But yet, again, this coal plant is there producing energy for Las Vegas, Phoenix, and for Los Angeles, like the other 4 coal-fired power plants that just bring respiratory illnesses that actually took the family member who's in that picture that they're holding, and where it came with the promise of jobs, but yet all the men in the picture aren't there because they're off working in some other state, because it didn't come with jobs for the people who were living there. It came with jobs, and then it brought the people as well in the jobs. And so just the sheer injustice of these type of things. And I paint this picture and share these stories to say that this isn't the kind of thing where we can just talk about tweaking an existing system. We really need a complete, our motto is around systems change, not climate change, because we need to have a total transformation, a total revolution if we were really gonna afford all rights for all people in the context of catastrophic climate change. We also see the intersection with criminalization. And so again, as I talk with the NAACP about climate being a threat multiplier, everything from where we've seen the folks who were shot on the bridge trying to escape after Hurricane Katrina, and when we see the lessening of resources, we see more and more of this kind of conflict and insecurity, and we see it directly intersecting with the Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter, whether it's in the context of these communities that are disproportionately being polluted upon, and Black Lives Matter in the context of the racial profiling that happens in the context of disasters, and on and on and on. And so we see all that is connected. We also see that the United States' relationship with the rest of the world and how, and different industrialized nations, we talk about immigration and we talk about immigrants often in the context of making it sound like they're invading, when really we're the ones on the other side pushing people out of their countries with our extractive and exploitive practices. And so we need to be looking at that in that context and see that in terms of how we engage with the immigration rights movement. I just found this on, someone posted this on my timeline on Facebook the other day, and it really struck me and touched me. A poem by this woman who is a Kenyan-born Somali poet. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So I really, just really struck me. And it also made me remember 5 years ago, we held a meeting with, it was a Katrina to Copenhagen meeting in preparation for the UN climate talks that happened in Copenhagen. And this woman, Tracy Coons, she's the founder and director of the Louisiana Bayou Keepers. And in the context of that conversation around the threats that climate change brings to her lifestyle and her livelihood as a water keeper, she talked about how she could actually identify with the Somali pirates. And that, again, was one of the most moving moments in my work around this, because she said that, she can see how someone would be driven to desperation as their livelihood is eaten up, as their ability to be able to provide for their families. And, she just said desperate times calls for desperate measures, and she feels that level of desperation to such an extent sometimes that she wonders what she can do. And so that just struck me when she made that comment. And yet we just have people continuing to pollute with impunity and continuing to make very low ambition as it relates to the changes that we need to make. So we talked about earlier this common but differentiated responsibility concept, and we have to view that in the fact that the US is 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the global emissions that drive climate change. And these are the types of policies and practices that they're trying to encourage in the global south: RED, population reduction, low carbon development. And this is a quote from Martin Luther King: all progress is precarious, and the solution of one problem brings us face to face with another problem. So RED, is this kind of concept. It's a market-driven, again, mechanism where it's kind of this notion of being able to trade for permits, and if you grow this many trees, then you can trade for your ability to pollute. And so it's kind of convoluted, but the indigenous community is very much against it because it doesn't give enough definition about how you can grow, what you can plant, and whether you have kind of you're taking away biodiversity for kind of these monocrops that people are planting instead. then someone, every once in a while, I'll get these conversations where someone will say in the middle of a climate change discussion, oh, I'll talk about the elephant in the room. What about population? And so they'll try to get me to say that we need to do population control as a climate change measure. But again, going back to U.S. being 4% of the population and 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, and that's good compared to our 33% recently. So one of the people, because of the way he said it, I was maybe a little bit touchier than I would have been. So I kind of said, well, if we really wanted to do that, we could wipe off the U.S. population, and then we'd be in good business. And so, but that's the kind of thing that drives you when you know that someone is saying that they have this notion of whose population needs to be controlled, and it's usually people in the global south. So, and then there's kind of false notions of clean coal and other types of technology that we can use to techno-fix our way out of this situation. Cap and trade market-based mechanisms and some of the ways that people go about thinking that we can get our way out of this. And so we have the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance really calling out for justice around resource allocation as they try to deal with this. We have Greenpeace, who actually very cleverly put this on, this is in Warsaw, projected their message there on one of the cooling stations for one of the plants. We have places like Australia who are, going the wrong direction on their climate commitments. Canada, Russia, and Japan withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol. United States with their low ambition. And we have these types of entities that are controlling our processes and our decision making. And with Citizens United, this is only just kind of growing in terms of a corporate overreach. And they're buying kind of denialism and taking us to get in the wrong direction. And therefore stomping on our democracy and our ability to really weigh in and see the types of real decisions that we need to make. We have Halliburton, who actually applied for a vote to have an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act while they frack. So just that notion of that level of kind of chutzpah and kind of, requesting an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act is just unbelievable. I would have showed you this video, but my time is pretty much up, but you should definitely watch it. It's the Climate Name Change by 350. It kind of talks about what we should be doing in terms of renaming our storms against policymakers that deny climate change. So when we talk about joint action, when the last time I was with the NAACP in North Carolina, there was a chant as we walked through the state building. It was, when civil rights are under attack, what do? Stand up, fight back. And so that was what we were all marching as the police was chasing us around the State House. But so as we do this fighting back, we really look at resistance against these toxic practices and the corporate overreach, resilience in terms of growing our community to be resilient to the impacts of climate change, reclamation of our system and reclamation of our rights as it relates to reclaiming our energy grid, reclaiming our right to grow our own food locally and nutritious foods, reclaiming our ability to reclaim products that we throw away and that end up being buried in a landfill or burned, both of whom are which are polluting processes. And they're really pushing for the types of systems change that we need. And just these are the types of systems that we're looking to change, and I won't go into much detail about those, but again, advancing true democracy, an article that myself and this author from Grist wrote, want to support clean energy, fight for voting rights, because again, as we said before, we see that as all inexplicably bound. Really pushing with our global South nation partners for radical change and increased decision-making equity in the United Nations processes, more aggressive emissions reduction than what the United States and others are pledging to now, a real shift towards clean energy, a farm bill, actually I was supposed to say farm bill, but agricultural policies that really work for people and provide rights for all people, and trade policies that also aren't so kind of regressive and dominating. And so in the meantime, we're also working on growing local economies, working on eco-villages, as I said, reclaiming the grid, power without pollution, energy without injustice. These are groups coming together talking about community-owned solar, community-owned wind, and so forth. So building, again, the changes that we want to see as we kind of reclaim the system. This is the Grid Alternatives, which offers low-income access to and also training folks on jobs to engage around solar. Right now, African Americans, energy being a $6 trillion industry, African Americans spend $15 billion a year on energy, only have 1.1% of the energy jobs, and have less than 1% of the energy sector. So that really not only talks about this being a sector that negatively and disproportionately impacts our communities, but also it's a sector that we're not involved in. And if we were involved, we would be seeing more of these types of, this type of move as opposed to what we have in terms of fossil fuel-based energy system that's actively poisoning our communities and Latino communities and others. Increased localization of food systems, increased education and access to education for all. And then this is just some pictures of all of us uniting in justice. This is in Durban, Stop the 1% from profiting from pollution, all walking out of the climate talks when they weren't making the right decisions there during the Typhoon Haiyan, the Warsaw talks. Uniting with Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, whose motto is 2 degrees is suicide. That's, again, around the low ambition that we have. Curtailing financing of fossil fuels. Actually, this was a successful campaign that got Bank of America to no longer finance coal as of a couple of months ago. Again, uniting around gender justice around the world, standing with different countries who are being differentially impacted, really eliminating corporate overreach around all these issues. And I'll just end with this last quote from Martin Luther King. One day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? That's in his Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqui. Yeah, I think what we're going to do now is just open this up for questions from the audience. So if we'll take, it seems to be the habit in this conference, we'll take a couple questions and then we'll have the panelists address those questions. So there must be something. I've got questions, but I want to have you have questions. Mark was looking for it. Mark was looking for Mike. Oh, okay.
This was a fantastic series of presentations. I mean, going from sort of the philosophical to looking at the whole world, focusing on the real human impact. And I was sometimes really made hopeful, and other times, I mean, just about like brought to tears thinking about the implications here. Where do we go from here, I guess would be my big question. I mean, we're at a human rights conference. What does the human rights framework actually offer here, and how can we implement that and make positive change in these rights violations that we're seeing?
I think Jacqui started to address it, but Mark, were you going to ask much the same thing, or?
No, I sort of had a similar thing about how the human rights. Yeah, excellent panel. But here's my real concern, really for you, Jacqui. I see how they're related, and you made the case. Sort of gender inequality, just oppression of people of color, poverty, and where that sits in the communities. I really think, and Tariq's made this point, not just here today, but when we had dinner the other night, that the people in the coal company and oil, they get this. They get that, and they're going to fix it, right? But they're not going to fix it in a way to help. They care about that. They don't care about you. So we're going to have, if these agendas are related, but we really have to disaggregate them and pay attention to this discrimination factor, this inclusive society, because they can fix it. We can have a green society, and the people you represent can still be just as unequal and just as oppressed and just not benefiting in that society. So that's a comment, I get it, but the question is, how do we keep these agendas connected in a way that makes sense, but understand that we're going to fix that and we're going to ignore you again.
Okay, and that's good. That ties into Tony's. And then there's one more question here, maybe, and then we'll have the panelists address those three.
Hi, my name is Kostas Koutsibas. I'm a PhD student from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I would like to ask you, do you think there is any deeper connection between indigenous peoples and climate change. Because for me, all of these non-accountable, non-transparent growth so far has been based on cultural and physical genocide of indigenous people, especially in the developed countries. And I think for me, maybe the human rights is where they can help in terms of advocacy and self-determination of these people, both in developed countries, mainly Australia, Canada, United States, and also in developing countries. So I would like to hear if you see any deeper connection between those two, indigenous peoples and climate change. Thank you.
Okay, so I can have, who would like to start?
I can say something, especially about the last question. I think one of the things that really impressed me about the other papers here is how they really invoke the issue of time, especially when you look at that spike in just a matter of a few hundred years. That's when we decided the past didn't matter. We left the state of nature. The past didn't matter, and we can stop thinking about the future because we got all the energy needs we have right now. So we can just focus on the now. And I think particularly when we look at other populations, like some of that Jacqui talked about, and your question about indigenous peoples, talking about a different understanding of time, different understanding of our connections with the past. If you got to collect firewood, you got to think ahead. You know, you got to really think ahead about what's happening in the future, and you got to prepare for that. And if you think about what's just to do with the land, you think about your people in the past, and indigenous people typically do this more. You know, that we are connected to the past in a way that matters. I tend to focus on constitutions and constitutional rights and adding constitutional provisions because constitutions are the documents that we write that are supposed to cover time. You know, that they invoke what we believed in the past and will continue to believe in the future, and they protect the rights that we claimed in the past and assume that people in the future have to have. So I'm not saying that the only thing we need to do is put environmental rights in every constitution and we'll be fine. But it's one way to start thinking again about what is our connection to what went before and what's coming.
Tariq, yeah.
Well, you see, I ask, sort of, you know, think of it as a fork. There is a tendency to think in, how should we say, somewhat idealistic terms. And, you know, a lot of it, when you look at it, you know, we'd solve this problem or we'd solve this problem. There's also good to realize that we don't live in an idealistic or an ideal world. We live in a very profane world, and we are human beings with the same kind of tendencies that Hobbes talked about 400 odd years ago. So the question is, you know, it's not that I think that we are going to solve all the problems. What I thought was this, that by accident, we discovered a resource which helped us. We multiplied our ability by a factor of about 1,000. And that multiplication of a factor of about 1,000 gave us a lot of the things that we now take for granted. The threat is that it's going to disappear. And there is a good chance that we might have to go back to the pre-industrial age in which we have to reduce our energy consumption by 1,000. And that, of course, you know, for many people means that, you know, we might have to go back to the feudal system, and we might go back to a, you know, system that valued killing above everything else, as we all remember. The kind of challenge at that level that I ask myself is it, I mean, imagine a situation in which, number one, we were all grown up, that we could agree on some kind of a just system, that we could actually base something on some notion of justice, that we were grown up, that the human race had grown up to the point where we could do that. We are not there yet. Is it possible to foresee it in the future? So the way I look at it in answer to the first question is, what we need to do is to buy maybe 100 years and hopefully 200 years for our race to be able to solve this problem. And I think we are very lucky with this, that we can, if we do have some enlightened leadership, that we can find those 200 years. I think that we have enough potential in renewable energy to build up a cooperative system which would renew economic growth, build up a basis for cooperation across countries, and build up an alternative system which can replace pretty much the amount of energy that we're using and come back to a more stable one. It's not going to last forever because we cannot end up using that source of energy endlessly, but we can harness quite a bit of it. That's number one. Number two, the population growth. As the population growth comes down and as the number of people on the planet reduces, I think we have the capacity to be able to solve that problem. I mean, to reduce our pressure on the atmosphere and on the planet, and therefore to be able to do something. Now, I think it tells me that there is a potential strategy which can buy us about a couple of 100 years. And if that strategy is successful, the hope is that within 200 years, we would have reached the point where there would be a sufficient degree of equality and a sufficient degree of political maturity to be able to solve the political problem at a global level. Now, my own feeling is that if we had to solve this problem today, we cannot do it. If we basically had to cut down our energy consumption or to shift to something immediately or to just overall reduce our level of economic growth, it would actually mean much greater bloodshed and much greater violence, and that really scares the hell out of me. So my entire strategy is that what I want to do is to find a pathway that can eventually get us there. But it would only solve the immediate problem. It would not solve the longer-term problem. Herman Daly said something very interesting, and since I'm in a Catholic university, I think I can use it. He said, he was asked, what is the philosophy of sustainability, of the steady state? He said, the philosophy of the steady state is the philosophy of the Sermon on the Mount. Be not anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. I think if we can solve the evil today, we can find a pathway for us to be able to solve the evil that will show up 200 years later. But we need to find this. We need to find this pathway to actually be able to take the one step ahead. If we had to do it today, I don't think we can do it.
Jacqui, do you have something to add?
Yeah, sure. So I just addressed the question around kind of, even as we make these shifts, how can we make sure that, because there's this notion that kind of a rising tide will lift all boats, but unfortunately, we have to employ a lot more intentionality around it. And that's why, as I said, we don't limit ourselves to just talking about needing more clean energy, for example. That's why I've had to force myself to understand the utility business model, which I have no interest in whatsoever, and that's not the way I even think at all. And in order to be able to think about like how do we do it? Like, yes, shift to clean energy, yes, have more energy efficiency, but how can we do it in a way that directly involves these most impacted communities that are so deeply impacted by our existing energy system? We use the biblical, speaking of being in a Catholic university, quote, I use the biblical kind of metaphor around not putting the new wine of a clean energy economy into the old wineskins of an antiquated business model that's really built on utility-owned, utility-scale solar or utility-scale wind, or instead looking at really community ownership. And similarly with other industries, whether it's the food industry, the agriculture, animal-based food production is a large contributor to climate change as well because of the methane emissions that come from that. So even as we make that shift, we need to be looking at our existing kind of domination of that field, where we have Monsanto that's planting Terminator seeds that only have one cycle in terms of the growth that comes from those seeds, instead of kind of the naturally occurring seeds that generate with each crop. And those seeds are actually going over into farmers' lands and actually resulting in suicide from some farmers whose crops have been destroyed by these Terminator seeds somehow. I don't know all the particulars around that. So we need to be thinking about how we're regrowing our food system in a way that, again, uplifts all rights for all people and still enables us to produce the amount of food that we need. So we're really looking at each and every one of these systems to be explicit about the equity analysis in terms of who's being impacted and who's not by even the shifts that we're trying to make into better systems. So I just really wanted to address that specifically.
If I can make just a quick comment, I think that there have been hints at some of the solutions too in these comments about renewables being one of the greatest, I think, development projects unintentionally was Germany, Spain, and France diving into solar power, which increased the amount of installed capacity, which decreased the price of solar to where it's now available to everybody around the world at reasonable cost. And so the idea that you can, the word leapfrogging is often used, you can now use localized.
It's amphibious.
It's amphibious, yeah. You can use localized sources of energy to enable these developing countries to climb up that curve that Tariq showed. That is, I mean, the usual example of leapfrogging is the cell phone. The only thing that worries me about that is, since most countries could skip the landline stage, go right to cell phones, that's wonderful. The only thing that worries me about that example is it's the only one anybody can come up with. So the hope is that the renewable energy systems could do the same thing. And then it becomes also a matter of local employment. This gets us away from the centralized generation by a big utility. It's now localized generation and localized installation, localized care, perhaps more local manufacturing. So there's a really good sense in which that can change a couple of different paradigms at the same time and provide hope for development and access to energy.
Yeah, I just want to say this. You see, renewable energy has three problems. One is the problem of competitiveness, which means it has to compete with fossil fuels. And again, because of the feed-in tariff program in Germany, the cost of renewables have come down dramatically. I mean, you know, from about $6 per watt in the 1970s to about $3 per watt at the beginning of the millennium to about 70 cents per watt today. And that's, you know, roughly competitive. I mean, there are technical problems in terms of distribution, but that's the one problem. The second problem is what we call the problem of affordability. The problem is this, that you see here, raise your hand, how much do you pay for electricity per kilowatt hour? Per kilowatt hour. Wow. Amazing. You know, I've asked this question in the United States so many times, and roughly no more than about 1% of the people can answer that. Why is that? Because it's unimportant. But if you ask people in developing countries, it makes a big difference. I mean, I showed you, you know, we consume on average, I mean, including everything, not only in our home consumption, 250 kilowatt hours per person per day. Of that, approximately 100 is household, I mean, buildings and so on and so forth. 8 cents at 100 kilowatt hours per person per day is $80. In the household, we consume no more than somewhere about 500 to 1,000 kilowatts per month. It really doesn't matter. But for somebody who's earning $2 a day, 8 cents per kilowatt hour means you can consume 1 kilowatt hour per person per day, you know, because you really cannot afford it. So we want to bring down the cost of renewable energy so that poor people who are $2 per day can afford it. And the third problem is political, that the people who are invested in fossil fuels have all the power today. The value of oil and coal in the ground is more than the value of all of the capital stock put together in the world. All your factories and machines and houses and cars and everything is less than the value of oil and coal in the ground. Think about it. So we have an enormous concentration of economic power and political power. So we have these three problems. I think the affordability problem and the competitiveness problem, we are at the threshold, we can fix it. We even proposed through the United Nations, when I was at the United Nations, that we should invest all this $100 billion a year in renewable energy. Within 10 years, it would be dirt cheap because the way the costs are coming down. The political problem is really the problem that is holding us back. So,
and I think with that, then we should wrap up at the end of our time. Can you join me in thanking our speakers again? Well done. Mark or Yusuf, are you going to say a last word or two?
This was excellent. You know, if this was a plenary, I would have a big long speech and about all the things we want to do on the agenda. But we're all tired. It was an incredible few days. Thank you for coming. All of the participants, the papers on Friday, the panels. It exceeded our expectations, and we had high expectations. I sat listening as someone who directs research at the center and is in charge of this, and then thinking about collaborative relationships and projects and the things we have to do around this. I could hear myself saying, we need to do that. We need to do that with you. we don't have competitive advantage in this, so we're not going to do that, but we've learned from this. I mean, just an agenda in my mind, and I know in my colleagues, and we're going to talk about those. What I'm hoping is you are doing the same things and thinking about how you can collaborate with us or with others, even if we're not involved. What is certainly going to happen is I'm going to be after you real soon. It's traditional here to produce proceedings on these, sort of the conclusions, and I want to get that to you and have your feedback. What is this we learned? Nothing about me without me, so let's do that. And so I can write it up, and but I want you involved. And I really want you to think in the days and weeks to follow about what was said here and how we can work together. And I want specifically to think about our business model, right? Our working at the frontiers of research and advocacy, our outreach to NGOs and to other universities to say, we're here to help through research, education, and dialogue. So how can we help you? How can we work together? I mean, just to give you an example, Cesar Rodriguez just left, and in addition to him inviting me to Columbia first time in 30 years, which was great, he gave me a very specific project. Two very specific projects where he actually needs our help and he thinks we can help. So if you have those projects, call us. But we know what our strategic priorities are, and I've heard a lot of you, so we know how you can help us. So it's this two-way street. How can we help you? Let us know, but I'll certainly be contacting you because I've got a sense of how you can help us. Does that make sense? No, I mean, it's Saturday at 5:10, so I know that didn't make sense. Other than to say this was incredibly enriching. I thank you all, and you're going to hear from us soon. Safe travels. Thank you. We'll see some of you at the hotel. I know some of you have to leave, but thank you very much. This was wonderful.